Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to DCC Shop. In this episode, I'm going to finish up the Bachmann large-scale 242T that I started in the last episode. Last time I worked on the headlights and tearing down the engine. This time I'm going to install the rest of the components, do some programming, and give it a road test. So in the first episode, I installed a new headlight on the cab roof so that the engine will have a backup light. I need to do a little more work in the cab area before moving on. So the next step is to prepare the inside of the cab. I'm going to use some of this channel from Evergreen to make a kind of a wire run to keep the wiring neat for the headlight. This was way too fussy to do on camera. What I've done is use the channels as a kind of a conduit. I glued a strip here and I glued a strip here, and the wires are tucked neatly in them so they won't show through the windows. So just to make sure none of that shows, I painted the channels black. So these cab doors are sprung and they're supposed to snap back to the closed position. However, I don't know if the springs are old or what, but they just don't work very well anymore. And the battery's going to be in there anyway, so what I want to do is seal these shut. To accomplish that, I've cut a couple pieces of 40 thousandths black styrene. And I'm just going to glue them right across the doors. The factory speaker mounts back here, and unfortunately the speaker wires came detached. It was soldered to a pair of contact strips that ran across the floor. I guess they did that to keep it from being so visible. And then there were more wires soldered to the contact strips inside the model. However, I'm going to have more wires to deal with now, so I just took that out and I'm going to make a bigger hole here. All right, I've drilled a hole and mounted the switch here. This is going to show a little bit because it's going to stick down, but I couldn't really find another place to put it on this model since this model's so small. And I just put the wheels back on temporarily to test it, and this shouldn't be in the way. I mean, this is really, that would be a super tight curve for it to go all the way to the switch. And something else is hanging it up anyway, so this isn't going to interfere with anything. I figured maybe at some point I'll try to find a way to disguise this cosmetically. So I've drilled a hole and mounted the charging jack on the other side. This one's a little less critical because it doesn't stick down at all. So the look-sound decoder I'm using actually has two separate speaker outputs. And I was looking through my stash of speakers and I found this. And I was thinking, since that speaker that's already in the engine is a little bit small, maybe I should add a second one. This is an 8 ohm 2 watt speaker, so it should work just fine. So I was thinking that with the smoke unit gone, I've got all this room in the smoke box. So this speaker will fit in there. It's a little bit small, so I'm going to have to make some kind of a mount. But I think that could make the sound a little bit better. So to fabricate a speaker mount, I started by cutting two squares that are 40 millimeters by 40 millimeters, because 40 millimeters is the inside diameter of the smoke box. And then I cut a couple of holes in these and laminated them together. And one of these holes is slightly larger than the other, and that's to accommodate the speaker. So this speaker, like a lot of speakers, has a little plastic circle that's a little bit smaller than this metal part here. So I cut one of the holes to fit this smaller circle and one of the holes to fit the bigger circle. So the speaker mounts like this, and now all I have to do is round it off so that it'll fit inside the boiler. So I don't really have any fancy tools for this. I'm just going to nibble off little pieces at a time. So now I've got the ring cut down to an approximate circle, and now I just need to file it a little bit. There's no real trick or shortcut to this, unfortunately. Just a lot of trial and error. So it's really hard to show this, but there's some things that stick out in here. There's a little stud that comes from this part, and there's also a little screw and a couple little plastic studs from this part that kind of are interfering with where I need to put the speaker. So I'm going to grind those away. So now that I finished all the stuff in here that was protruding and being in the way, I'm able to mock up the speaker. And I've positioned it so that the front of the speaker is just in front of the smokestack, because there's a hole here, so that'll help the sound come out. And then the rest of this back area, or I guess I should say front area, will be the speaker enclosure. So the only issue, and it's relatively minor, is that the boiler face won't go on all the way. So I'll just need to cut these posts down that were used to mount the circuit boards that I removed. I don't need those anymore, so there's no reason to keep this. So I'm just going to use my plastic sprue cutters to cut these posts off. And that should take care of the fit problem. I drilled some holes in the little plastic ring I made for the speaker. 2 of these will be for the speaker wires and 2 of these will be for the headlight. I'm going to use some RTV silicone to attach the speaker to the speaker mount that I made. I'm using a small screwdriver to spread some silicone around in the little ring that I made. Now with the silicone in there, I can just insert the speaker, rotate it around a little bit to make sure it's spread out evenly, and that should do it. So this speaker is marked with a plus and a minus for the polarity, and the one that came with the model is marked in exactly the same way. So I want to make sure that I color code the wires so that I can maintain that so the speakers stay in phase. So I got rid of the original wires from the factory speaker and I put new leads on both speakers. I used purple on the positive side on both and brown on the negative side on both. That's just my own color coding, but that'll help me keep the speakers in phase when I hook them up to the decoder board. So for the sake of my own sanity, I'm going to thread these wires through the holes in the mounting ring that I made before I put it in the model. So for a little extra strength, I'm going to make some clamps of my own out of some spare styrene and glue them like that in a couple spots just to kind of hold the speaker to the ring. Alright, so here it is with the mounts attached. The silicone that I used actually holds the speaker pretty well, but this is just a little insurance. I've threaded the headlight wires through the second set of holes that I drilled in the ring. Now I can put this in the model. I kind of wish I'd cut the headlight leads a little longer now, but I think they'll be all right. I use a little liquid styrene cement to secure the ring. Yeah, I think that's going to work pretty well. Last, I'm going to use a little more RTV silicone just to make sure this is nice and sealed around the edges. I use a little bit more to carefully seal up the boiler face since this doesn't have to open anymore. And now I can put the boiler face back on the model. So it's a little difficult to see, but the wires for the headlight are here, speaker wires come out here, and the hole for the smokestack is right here in front of the speaker. So that provides an exit for the sound. So if you saw the last episode, I was thinking originally of putting the air wire board and the decoder in the boiler. However, I think I might move the air wire board back into the cab for a couple of reasons. One, there's these pieces that stick down inside the boiler that are going to potentially have an effect on what's in here if, I stray beyond the boundaries of these two things. I don't think they really serve any purpose. Looks like there were some attachment points here, but those were already cut off when I opened the model, so I don't really know what the point of this was. But anyway, I think the decoder will fit nicely in that space in there. And then putting the air wire receiver in the cab will simplify some of the wiring since I got the switch and the charging jack back here. I think it might also get a little bit better reception on this little antenna. So I think putting it in the cab is probably what I'm going to do. So I've already cut off all the plugs so that these are all just bare wire now. I'm going to trim down these little studs here to kind of make some room. I found this roll of double-sided foam tape in my stash of supplies. I'm going to use this to mount the board that the decoder attaches to. Incidentally, as I'm putting the tape on this, I noticed that the board here has connections both on the top and the bottom, so you could make use of whichever ones are convenient. They do appear to be the same. Like if you read what they are, they're all labeled. The labels match on the bottom, so I think you can use either one. All right, so I've started by installing the orange wire to the motor positive connection, the gray wire to the motor negative, and then these wires for the chuff sensor, one of them goes to ground and the other one goes to a connection called WHS, which I guess stands for wheel sensor. I'm not sure, but anyway, that's what the instructions say to do. So that's what I did so far. So I've connected all the black track power wires together and all the red track power wires together. Now these aren't going to get connected directly to this board. Remember, this has to go through the whole switching system that I described in the first episode. So I'll need to run some more wire before I do that. So I'm going to turn my attention back to the cab. I've reinstalled the speaker and I've run the wires around and through the hole that I drilled earlier. So I've soldered wires to the charging jack, and I used a little test jack and a voltmeter to make sure that the red goes to red and the black goes to black. That way I'll know that the battery is going to get charged properly. I'm using 22 gauge stranded wire for all of these connections that might have higher current draw. I'm okay using the little wire for the lights and the speakers, but you know, there could be more power going through these. I have this connector that came with the battery, so I figure I might as well use it. The battery has a matching connector, so if I ever need to change the battery, it should be pretty easy. Alright, so I've attached the charging jack to one side of the switch, and these wires to the other side. These are going to go to the air wire receiver. And then in the center is the connector for the battery. So the switch, as I explained in the diagram in the first episode, is either going to let the battery connect to the charging jack for charging, or it's going to connect the battery to the air wire receiver. I've set this up too so that when the switch is toward the outside of the locomotive, that means outside power, and that's the charging position. And if it's switched to inside, that means inside power, which is battery. I will probably put a label on the bottom or something, but that makes it a little bit logical in any case. The only other thing I'll say about this is a fairly small toggle switch, so it's really important to make sure that there's no shorts between the connections when you're soldering, no stray wires or anything like that. So I'm just taking my time and doing it very carefully. So I've hooked up a pair of wires to the switch for the track power, and these go into the boiler through this hole that I drilled earlier. And I've labeled these tracks so that I don't get them confused with the wires that are going to go to the decoder. Alright, so I finished wiring the switch, and I've added some more temporary labels. This is the receiver in, which goes to the input of the airwire board. This is the receiver out, that goes from the output of the airwire board. This is the wires to the decoder, and then of course the track, as I already mentioned. So just to try to keep things neat, I've used a couple of cable ties on the wire. I've used some of that same double-sided foam tape on the bottom of the battery, and I'll peel this backing off and then I can install it on the cab floor. So as I mentioned before, there is just a little bit of airspace right here, so I think that should still allow the sound to come out. I'm going to paint a couple of these red wires just so that they don't show so much through the cab windows. So I used some more foam tape to put the air wire receiver on top of the battery. This has screw terminals for the wires, but I went ahead and tinned them with solder anyway just to make sure that there's no stray strands. Just stick them in and screw it down. And I give it a little pull just to make sure it's really in there. So just to recap, the wires that come from the switch that eventually hooks to the battery come up here to the power connection on the air wire receiver, and then the output wires go to the part of the switch that directs the DCC signal. So it either the DCC will either come from here or it will come from track power, depending on how this switch down here is set. So on the power input on this, the polarity is important. The plus side is marked, and so that goes to the red wire. The DCC output I don't think matters as much, but it does say to put the right side of the engine on here if you reference the instructions, which they're labeled A and B. So A is the right side and B is the left side. So I've gone ahead and match this to how the engine's wired. So it's actually backwards from this one, but I'm pretty sure this is correct, although DCC is, the polarity isn't that important, so I don't think it would matter that much if you mess this one up, but if you mess this one up, it could damage things, so you don't want to do that. So not that I recommend doing this, but the foam tape is strong enough to hold the battery when the engine's upside down. So if I accidentally, turn the engine upside down, or if it falls on its side because of a derailment or something, I think I'll be all right. So I realized in hindsight it would have been better to run the wires for the rear headlight before I put the battery in. However, I didn't do that. So what I did is took a page from working on my house and I used a piece of scrap wire as kind of like fish tape. And I soldered it to these wires, and I'm just going to use this to pull it through. All right, well, as usual, when you're putting a DCC install back together, trying to assemble everything without pinching wires can be a little bit of a fussy process. So I finally got the cab back on, and I'm also testing the backup light to make sure it still works, which it does, so that I didn't, break anything in the process. So now the rest of the connections can be made inside the boiler. So you can see some of the stuff inside the cab a little bit, but overall I don't think it looks too bad. And I think under, normal conditions, when you're just running the engine around outside in the garden layout, I think it'll be fine. So the last step for the cab is to reinstall the screws and some of the other details that I had to take off to disassemble it in the first place. So before I do anything else, so I don't forget, if you remember when I set up the rear headlight, I wasn't able to put a resistor inside the headlight casting like I did in the front because it wouldn't fit. So I went ahead and soldered a resistor in here and then shrink tubed it so that it'll be insulated. That way I'll make sure that I don't blow the rear headlight, which would be very bad at this point. So if you recall, one of the pairs of red and black wires that come down from the cab were labeled track power, and I've connected those to the wires that come up from the chassis, and I've put shrink tubing around them, so black to black and red to red. So the other pair of red and black wires, which are the DCC signal, connect to track R and track L on this board. So I've connected the negative lead from the front headlight to this FL, which means front light. The yellow wire, which is from the rear headlight, goes to RL, which is for rear headlight. And then the blue wires go to this U+, which is the common. That's over on this side. And finally, I've connected the speakers to the speaker 1 and speaker 2 positive and negatives. If you recall, I used purple for positive and brown for negative, so that way I can be sure that they're in phase. And that should be it for the soldered connections. The last thing is to actually insert the decoder into the mounting board. If you notice, there are more pins on one side than on the other side. This has one less pair. So this should only fit one way. That makes it a little easier to figure out which way to put it in. Now that I've made sure all the pins are lined up, I'm just going to press it in there, and that should do it. So I've used some more cable ties just to keep the wiring neat. Before I put all this back together, though, I think it would be a really good idea to test it. So that's what I'm going to do next. So the first thing I want to test is my battery charger, and it seems to be working normally. The red light came on, which is what it's supposed to do when it's charging. And now I just need to leave this for a while until it finishes. So I left this overnight because it takes a while. This is not a fast charge, but the light did go green, so that means everything worked as it should, and the battery should be charged. So LokeSound does not have a specific sound set for a 242T. However, looking at the construction of the engine, I decided that a 440 was probably the closest thing mechanically to this. So that's what I'm downloading, is a sound set for a 440. All right, so I've temporarily put the body of the locomotive back on the chassis. It's just kind of sitting there right now, and that's just because it was easier to do that than try to have it off to the side on the programming track. This is a multi-scale programming track that I made in a previous episode of DCC Shop. That's here on the channel if you want to see a detailed breakdown of how I actually put this together. It's got the Loc Programmer device on it, and it's wired to large scale HO, N, and Z tracks. So pretty much anything I've got that uses DCC I can put on this thing. Anyway, right now my laptop is writing the sound file to the engine. This takes a little time typically, so I'm just going to let it go and we'll come back later. So writing the sound files to a Loc-Sound decoder is kind of a slow thing. It takes maybe up to an hour or so. Fortunately, you only have to do this part once, unless you want to change the sound set in the engine. Just programming CVs is a lot faster. So while we're waiting, I should probably mention that the switch is in the track power position right now, and the fact that I can communicate with the decoder means that at least that much of it is working properly. Okay, so now that the sound file is finished loading, we can actually test the engine. So let's see what happens. And turn it on. Looks like the front light is working. And the rear light is working. Very good. So now let's see about the sound. So that's not too bad. I think I need to adjust the volume levels a little bit. The bell was a little low, and the whistle sounds good. The dynamo sound for the headlights is a little bit loud. But that's kind of normal. So I'm going to tweak this for a while, and then we'll see what happens with that. Okay, I played with the volumes a little bit. The dynamo is now not as loud, and the bell's a little louder. I may change that too, because I prefer a slower bell. I'm sure it has one. Have to experiment with which whistle I like. I also put the engine up on some rollers to try to see if the chuff sensor that I hooked up to the decoder will actually work. So let's see. And doesn't look like it. It is running, which is good, but that doesn't seem to be working, so I may need to tweak that a little bit. Okay, so I had to tweak the variable that controls how many sensor triggers per revolution. It was set like way up at 20. I put it down to like 2, and now it seems pretty good. It's 4 per revolution, like it should be. This particular sound set has like 5 whistles and 4 different bells. So they were both set at 0. I changed them both to 1, so let's see what we've got now. It's not bad. Alright, so that was a different bell sound. I kind of like it. See what else we got. Okay, so now I've set them both to 2. I definitely like that bell better. This is number 3 on both. All right, I like that too. Okay, so this will be whistle number 4 and bell number 4. That's cute. Okay, so this is still bell number 4 because that's as high as it goes, and whistle number 5. Okay, so for now anyway, I've settled on whistle number 3 and bell number 4. So I think that's good enough for now as far as the programming. I'll probably end up tweaking it some more down the road, but I think I'll leave it where it is for the moment. It's good enough for testing it out. The one thing I did notice is that I guess because of the weight of the battery, the engine has a little bit of a tail down stance now, and that front driver is off the rails. So I'm going to need to try to do something to counterbalance it. So I spent some time messing around with stick-on weights to try to counterbalance this battery, but I wasn't able to put enough weight in the model to do that. I think this one's just too heavy. So I'm going to switch to this smaller battery. This is a 3.4 amp hour battery versus 6.8, so basically it'll have half the runtime. But better to have half the runtime in an engine that will actually work than one that's, doesn't have all its wheels on the rails. So I put the new battery in exactly the way I put the old one in. As you can see, you can now see through the cab windows, so unless you're really looking for it, it's not nearly as visible. And the model is now once again sitting on all of its wheels. It's still kind of a little bit, heavy in the back, but at least that front wheel's down on the rails now. Okay, so I put the engine back together, and I've also swapped out the stack because Bachmann thankfully included a straight stack in the box along with the diamond stack that was on the model before, but since it's an oil burner, the straight stack is probably more appropriate. Now what I need to do is to take my air-wire throttle and program the receiver to the same address as the decoder. I've already picked number 14 for this engine. Don't have any decals on it right now, but that was the address I landed on, so I need to make sure that the receiver is set to the same thing. Okay, so here goes. I'm going to switch it to battery power. It's making noise. Oh, it's even running. All right, so I did that, and now I have 14 dialed up on the throttle. Looks like we're in business. So in case you haven't seen the first episode, this engine had a footboard in the back, but it broke. So I replaced it with these Ozark Miniatures castings. So now it's time to give the engine a road test. Unfortunately, we live near an intersection and an airport, so getting clean audio is sometimes a little difficult. So one thing I noticed is that the range isn't very good from the throttle. I have to basically be right next to the engine in order to control it. AirWire does offer a longer antenna. I may investigate that option later. The engine's doing pretty well with one car and a caboose running around without any issues. I decided to try 4 cars in a caboose just to test its pulling power. It's doing okay in the flat sections. So there's a slight dip in the track here due to settling, and the engine stalled out trying to pull these cars through the dip. I don't expect miracles with an engine this small though. 4 cars might be a bit much for it. I think for a couple of cars in a caboose though, it should probably be fine. The sound is not especially loud. I kind of expected that too, since the speakers are relatively small for an outdoor engine. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the way this engine turned out. It could still use some decals and maybe a couple small details, but it's pretty close to being finished, and I'm glad to see that it runs well. If you enjoyed this video, then please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned and thanks for watching.